Welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video, we're going to be talking about what anthropocentrism is. This video is the first video in a series of videos and within a course called Environmental Ethics. Our goal is to explore the way in which a variety of differing philosophers, moral and ethical philosophers, have approached the question of what our role, our duties, and our responsibilities are to the natural world. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things throughout the next series of videos, and I'm excited to have you join us, so welcome again. I will say that the book we're using, because I'll be referencing a number of different texts in each video, the book we're using is Environmental Ethics, The Big Questions, edited by David Keller. It's a great anthology of readings, and I encourage you to get it, and you can follow along. So once again, welcome to the course. I'm excited to have you, and I'm excited, more importantly, to talk about this issue. Now, I should, before we even begin, highlight the importance of this issue. Right now, as many people, probably most everyone in the world knows, we're undergoing a radical transformation in our natural environment. Everything from global climate change to the great die-off and the massive amount of extinction that is taking place in terms of animal species throughout the globe. Ecosystems throughout the whole world are collapsing. And so we're at a crisis point in terms of the science of where the natural world sits today. But it's important, at least, to address sort of how it is we can understand what our relationship is to the environment, or at least how philosophers have understood it, and kind of work our way through it. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be exploring a concept called anthropocentrism, and that's what today's video is all about. What we're going to be doing is exploring the philosophical dimensions and the implications of placing humans at the center of our understanding of the world. So let's just start with anthropocentrism. You can see here that the term is anthropocentrism. Or anthropology, you might think of, refers to human beings. Anthropocentrism is the notion that human beings are a central fixture in our understanding of the world. And in particular, with regards to moral and ethical philosophy, anthropocentrism is the idea, or refers to any moral philosophy in which our understanding of our relationship to the natural world is first and foremost organized around our understanding of human beings, and they are playing the central role. So let's kind of dive into it. Anthropocentrism positions humans as the focal point of existence. And this sort of parallels the notion of geocentrism, right? This worldview can be broken down into 5 key philosophical themes that explore 1, the hierarchical structure of nature; 2, the dualistic separation between human and non-humans; 3, a mechanistic view of nature; and 4, an instrumental value system which is attributed to non-human life; and number 5, the limitations of the moral community to being encapsulating humans alone. So that's what we're going to kind of take a look at in this video. It'll be very important to understand the development of environmental ethics as we go forward. Now, there's 4 different types of anthropocentrism that we're going to talk about. One is the notion that nature and the value of things are hierarchically ordered. This is known as the great chain of being, and this comes from medieval philosophy. This is the notion that God's on top, then I guess there's angels, and then humans, and then there's animals, and so on and so forth. The great chain of being argues is a medieval conception which argued that ultimately there's a hierarchy, an ontological hierarchy, a hierarchy of being that helps us understand a certain hierarchy of values. We're also going to talk about metaphysical dualism, the notion that there is a physical world, but there may also be a spiritual world. We're also going to talk about the notion that nature can be conceived as a sort of mechanism, a machine, in which its value is attributed to its ability to output things. We'll also talk about instrumental valuation, the idea that maybe nature is conceived as a resource, but also we'll talk about the way in which the moral community in anthropocentric view is limited to humans alone. So let's start with this notion of the great chain of being. Now, the great chain of being is established within the Middle Ages as an understanding, an ontological and a metaphysical understanding about who's on top and how things are ordered. For instance, you can take a look at the work of Thomas Aquinas, and we'll be talking about that in a subsequent video. The great chain of being establishes a hierarchy in nature, which places God at the very top, which then, at least within the Christian worldview, if we're looking at Aquinas, goes through the angels and other spiritual dimensions. And then you have humans, and notably the great chain of being says that males or men are on top, women come next, and then all of the animals, the plants, and then brute matter itself, dirt, if you will. And this great chain of being organizes the importance, the value, and the hierarchy also is established in terms of the intellectual tradition. The idea being that God has the greatest intellect, and intellectuality is hierarchically organized down the chain. So this arrangement underscores the notion of a structured universe where each entity has a defined place. Now, when we talk about anthropocentrism, the great chain of being is a good place to start if we want to understand our current position. And of course, I'm recording this video and I'm a member, if you will, or a citizen of the Western world, which is predominantly or has historically been predominantly Christian in nature. So we begin there because that history organizes the set of values that have been typically applied to the environment. So let's talk about this. There is within the great chain of being a notion, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent video, is that the domain of human beings is such that human beings rule over the animals in the natural world. So St. Thomas Aquinas asserted, he's a great important philosopher. In fact, he's considered the doctor of the Catholic Church. So if you're Catholic and you're watching this, St. Thomas Aquinas is technically your philosopher. But Aquinas asserted that rational beings have dominion over animals, and he used the biblical scriptures as well as a number of rational arguments to support his view. And this led to the interpretation that animals are primarily resources for humans to use. Now, this view reinforces the belief in the idea that human beings have a moral, ethical, and ontological superiority to the natural environment. And therefore, the ethical considerations that human beings give towards the environment are always secondary to those of human beings, which in other words means that in terms of moral and ethical philosophy, human beings take first priority over the environment, which means that if we're going to look at something like the environment, we have to first and foremost ask what is good for human beings. Then we can ask the question of what's good for animals, and then we can ask the question about what's maybe good for the brute natural ecosystem, right? The landscape, for instance, and so on and so forth. So Aquinas asserts an anthropocentric view, and he's not shy about it. For precisely a number of different reasons. And in a subsequent video, we'll take a look at these. And what you'll see is that Aquinas has actually some good reasons for thinking this. Though you'll see that most environmental ethicists today deny anthropocentrism, so they're against it. Now, what are some of the ethical implications of human superiority? Well, the implications, as we mentioned before, suggest that since only humans are considered morally considerable, it's acceptable to use animals for human purposes. And this means we can kill them as necessary. We can use animals for food, first and foremost. We can also use them to help clothe ourselves. Think about leather, for instance. And we can use them for other purposes, including, for instance, economic purposes. So this perspective raises, though, significant ethical debates, particularly when we get to contemporary discussions within environmental ethics. And in later videos, you'll see that most environmental ethicists are against this view. But we should recognize that this is the baseline view within the tradition, philosophically. But it's probably the baseline of where most people understand their relationship to the environment today. If we were to poll people, most people probably would conform and agree to some form of anthropocentrism. Even you watching this video. I don't know you, but I'm going to assume, like the majority of people in the world, that you're not a vegetarian. If you're not a vegetarian, then that means that you already are supporting the killing of animals for your own food, which means you probably, and of course I'm projecting here on you, you probably agree with some aspects of anthropocentrism. Now, we should mention, though, that just because anthropocentrism centers the human, this doesn't necessarily mean that philosophers agree with the idea that we should be cruel towards the environment or to animals in particular. A good notable example here is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he anticipated the dangers of cruelty towards animals, and he argued that this doesn't mean that simply because our moral considerations begin with human beings first, it doesn't mean that we have the right or that we should be cruel towards human beings. Now, notably, his view was that cruelty towards animals will lead to cruelty towards humans. Now, we'll talk about Kant in a subsequent video, but what we can say right now here is that we have to be careful. Simply because anthropocentrism centers the human, it doesn't necessarily mean the anthropocentric view is endorsing an irresponsible view of mistreating the environment or mistreating animals. This conception that Kant articulated emphasizes that there is a moral responsibility that humans have towards animals. And even Thomas Aquinas argued something similar. And so there's a number of broader implications for human ethics as a consequence. Now, let's take a look at another type of anthropocentrism. And this is sort of rooted in the metaphysical dualism, which comes from, notably, the philosopher René Descartes. Now, what is dualism? Dualism is the metaphysical view that there are two types of reality. The reality is essentially bifurcated into two domains. One domain would be the physical, for instance, the body. Another domain would be the spiritual or the intellectual, the mind. So metaphysical dualism, particularly in the type of work that we see within the modern philosopher René Descartes, seems to indicate or has been used in order to defend certain forms of anthropocentrism. So let's make a distinction. On the one hand, we can talk about human beings, but let's also differentiate that from non-human nature or animals in particular. And we'll see that many philosophers historically, and Descartes, of course, being the prime example, argued that human beings occupy a unique position. A unique position because human beings have both, if you will, a soul, a spirit, a mind, but they also have a body, a physical existence. Now, Descartes would go on to argue that ultimately animals only have a physical existence, but human beings have this special form of existence, which he called and referred to as our immaterial and immortal soul. Based upon this metaphysical duality, anthropocentrism was given a sort of metaphysical legs upon which to stand. So human beings have an immortal soul, and as a consequence, that means that our ethical and moral considerations have to be organized accordingly. Now, Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy, and so his influence has been extraordinary within the history of philosophy, which means that because he initiated what's called the rationalist tradition within metaphysical philosophy. And so what that means, though, is it means that the philosophers after Descartes, all the way up until the present moment, have in a dominant fashion adopted this sort of dualism in one way or another. Now, there's notable examples, and I've recorded videos about that. You can take a look at that. Take a look at Gilbert Ryle's work, where he criticizes this form of dualism. But regardless, this dualism has played a major influence in terms of the history of philosophy and the way in which ultimately we ourselves, as just citizens and beings who live in the world, understand our position and our place in the world, and therefore our position in our relationship to the environment. Now, out of Descartes' perspective of dualism, grew a sort of mechanistic perspective in which what differentiates us as human beings from the environment is the environment essentially is a sort of mechanism. It's a system of operations organized by natural laws. In the same way that a machine works according to natural laws, so too does the natural world, and so too do animals. The difference Descartes would hold is that human beings, because of their soul, are able to articulate, they have a mind, they can think. And that thinking is something that's fundamentally separate. You might also say that human beings have freedom, whereas animals, like machines, from Descartes' perspective, do not. So we can also conversely think about this in terms of living systems. So conversely, viewing nature as a living system emphasizes the interconnections in the intrinsic values of all beings. Now, this living systems perspective is a different perspective than the metaphysics that we see coming out of Descartes. But as we continue to explore environmental ethics in this course, you're going to see this system and this discussion of living systems articulate. This perspective, which is different from Descartes, fosters a sense of stewardship and responsibility to nature, arguing against the mechanistic view of exploitation and the simple domination over non-human life. So let's make a contrast here. Descartes in the modern tradition has a mechanistic view of nature, but there might be an alternative perspective. We'll come to that later. Let me just skip through that, sorry. Now, one of the things that's worth mentioning here is what we call instrumental value in nature. So let's begin by defining what we mean by instrumental value. There's essentially two types of value. So if you talk about value, a value is when you recognize something as being important as opposed to something else, right? So for instance, I have a bottle of water. The water is valuable to me because I need it to drink in order to live my life. It's more valuable than, let's say, the pen I have here, which is not going to help sustain my life. So notice here that value is a central category within ethics, and value is when we recognize when something is more or less important. There's two types of value, though. The first type of value is instrumental value. Instrumental value means that something is valued because it's understood as being a means unto an end. It's understood as an instrument. So I gave the example of the bottle of water. The water, right, itself, do I value it? Yes, I value it, but I only understand its value as being a tool for something that I can use to help quench my thirst, right? To keep me alive. So, for instance, notice that if the water gets contaminated, I no longer value it. I'll just throw it out or pour it out. Why? Because it's no longer useful to me, right? The same thing here. I have a coffee cup here. If the coffee cup begins to leak, I'll throw the coffee cup away. Why? Because it no longer has value, because it's no longer an instrument to me. Now, within the anthropocentric view, animals in the natural world are understood as having only instrumental value. The value of the natural world is merely a means unto an end. And what's that end? Well, it's human beings. That's what anthropocentrism means. Now, when I say instrumental value, we have to also recognize there's different types of instrumental value. It also is the case that, for instance, if I go to a national park, let's say I go to the Grand Canyon and I look out at the beautiful canyon, it also has aesthetic value to me, right? It's beautiful and I enjoy looking at it, but it's still instrumentally valuable to me in that regard. Now, by contrast, we can talk about something which has intrinsic value. Intrinsic value means I value it for its own sake. I don't value it for what it does for me or how it can be useful. I value it in and of itself. Think, for example, the way in which a mother might value her child, right? A mother, at least a good mother, will value her child because she loves her child, not because her child is useful to her. So anthropocentrism asserts that non-human nature lacks and doesn't have intrinsic worth or value, and is only valuable solely for its utility and usefulness to human beings. Now, this perspective prioritizes human needs and interest over ecological considerations. But to be clear, anthropocentrism doesn't necessarily deny the importance of ecological considerations, because after all, human beings live in the world. We live in an ecology. And if that ecology is not working and is deficient and is collapsing, it's a problem for human beings as well. Now, let's reference someone here, a great philosopher, John Locke. Now, John Locke, you may know him either from his political philosophy, which is most likely, but also you may know him from his epistemological philosophy. He wrote an essay, a very famous book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Now, John Locke proposed that God designated Earth as a common resource for humanity, and he emphasized that value is assigned only when nature is altered through human labor, thus creating private property. So one of the things that's interesting here is that John Locke's view was that nature itself ultimately doesn't have any value. It's just valueless. And think here the way in which, imagine, for instance, the planet Jupiter. While you're watching this video, the planet Jupiter is flying around the sun and it's out there in outer space, but no one really cares anything about it at all. I mean, well, maybe the astronomers do, but the rest of us don't live our lives every day without thinking about it at all. In that same way, John Locke argued that nature doesn't have any value, it's just valueless, up until the point at which we engage with nature in order to create things. We use our labor to create things. So, for instance, maybe I chop down a tree, and I turn the wood into lumber, and then I use the lumber in order to create a house. This creates private property. Now, one of the things that's interesting is what it means is, and by the way, keep in mind here, that John Locke's conception of private property is absolutely essential to, for instance, liberal forms of democracy and liberal governments. At the very center of, for instance, political representative democracies like the United States, but you can include any representative democracy, is the idea that the government is supposed to and organized to protect our private property. But where does private property come from, according to John Locke? It comes when human beings take nature, which has no value, use their labor, and create value. So John Locke is an example here of an anthropocentric view of nature. Now, Gifford Pinchot, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, so Pinchot, I think so, his early conservation policies advocated for the development of natural resources, arguing against leaving wilderness areas untouched. Now, why do I mention this, and why does our book mention it? It's because the early conservationist movement was a form, or depended upon, and adopted a form of anthropocentrism, where we're supposed to conserve the forest, but the reason we conserve the forest is so that A, we have the resources we need, and that B, we can enjoy it for its aesthetic value. But notice, under both those conditions, it's still a type of anthropocentrism. Now, what does this mean, and what's a final thing we want to think about here in terms of anthropocentrism, which is namely the idea that human beings are what make up the moral community, which means that animals and the natural ecological environment are not normally conceived as being a part of the moral community, which means that our moral considerations under this domain of anthropocentrism are always organized around the needs of the human community. In other words, anthropocentrism posits that the moral community is confined to humans. It's rooted in the belief that only rational beings hold intrinsic value. Immanuel Kant, as we discussed, argued that while humans lack direct moral obligations towards animals and nature, there may indeed be indirect responsibilities insofar as they organize our other responsibilities towards humans. Now, specifically, acts of cruelty towards animals are perceived as threatening to human moral dignity, particularly when children are involved, and so Kant argued that these behaviors cultivate harmful tendencies in their moral development. Now, Kant is just an example here of this notion of the idea that human beings make up and only make up the moral community towards which we have ethical responsibilities. Now, I should mention here, even though many of the environmental ethicists we're going to read in this course are against anthropocentrism, there is a contemporary defense of anthropocentrism, in particular from Beckerman and Posick. Now, Their view is that all interpretations of nature inevitably really are human-centered, even if we don't want to admit it. And this means that non-anthropocentrism also really is anthropocentrism, and that means that anthropocentrism is unavoidable. Why do they argue this? Well, namely because anthropocentrism itself is a human construct, and that human beings can't get out of the way in terms of creating foundational frameworks. And these frameworks, since they're created by humans, are necessarily going to organize value accordingly. Now, there's lots of contemporary defenses of anthropocentrism accordingly, and we'll talk about those as we go through the course. Well, with that said, the goal of this video is really just to introduce you to the notion of anthropocentrism and give you a sense of some of the different domains and issues that we need to take into account as we begin our study of environmental ethics. Now, in the next set of videos, we're going to explore some of the philosophical writings and arguments by some of these philosophers, including Thomas Aquinas, Francis Bacon, and Rene Descartes, and in their defense or their articulation of anthropocentrism. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it's helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you online in our next video. See you online.